In this video, I would like to give my commentary on the Kherson Counteroffensive, which, as you all probably remember, was being hyped up to no end by mainstream media in the West and also in Ukraine for the better part of 2 months. And I think that by now it is universally accepted, even by the most staunchly pro-Ukrainian media, that this counteroffensive isn't going to happen. And unsurprisingly, it took a very long time for these individuals to realize that this counteroffensive is never going to happen. First, around late July, we've heard some commentary from the Ukrainian media that this counteroffensive was already happening, but that the Ukrainian army was asked to not report on their progress or on this counteroffensive in any manner whatsoever, basically telling us, trust us guys, this counteroffensive is happening. No, we aren't going to show you any proof because of reasons. And shortly afterwards, in the first half of August, we've received commentary from various Ukrainian government officials telling us that this counteroffensive was basically a huge media disinformation operation that was meant to confuse the Russians. I should note that I am paraphrasing a little bit, but this was the gist of the message and how it evolved over time. And frankly, I have to say that the idea that this enormous media operation was being conducted over the better part of 2 months solely for the purpose of disinforming the Russian military, of making the Russian military believe that there was going to be a counteroffensive in a region where no such counteroffensive was being planned, that idea is idiotic. It is idiotic for a number of reasons, the main one of which is that it asserts that the Russian military has no way of obtaining any information as to what is going on the front lines besides listening to what the Ukrainian media says. In light of this, I view this statement of the Kherson counteroffensive being nothing more than a media disinformation campaign as little more than a poor excuse which is meant to justify the fact that the Kherson counteroffensive, which was in fact supposed to be very real and major, had actually failed before it even began. Now, in this video, I would like to explain why this counteroffensive failed. And specifically, this has to do a lot with the technical side of this war and the military hardware that is being employed. What we have to understand is that the Russia-Ukraine war is very different from every previous war that has ever been fought in history for a number of reasons that are related to technology and hardware. For instance, this is the first war, as far as I'm aware, where both sides have access to global satellite networks and are able to gain reconnaissance information and live data from them, with the Russians making use of their own satellite networks and the Ukrainians being constantly supplied information from American and likely also European reconnaissance satellites. And for our skeptics out there, I should mention that Ukraine's use of the Starlink satellite network has been heavily hyped up by the mainstream media since basically the start of this war, and I have no doubt that Ukraine's use of Western satellite systems goes well beyond what is publicly known. What this means in the context of an offensive or a counteroffensive is that whenever one side tries to initiate some sort of offensive, begins gathering the necessary manpower, the necessary hardware in that specific location where that offensive or counteroffensive is meant to take place, the other side is going to be able to spot that force concentration as it is being gathered and is going to respond accordingly by redeploying their own forces, by conducting missile and artillery strikes against logistics centers, fuel depots, ammo depots, and so on, basically doing everything to make the imminent offensive as difficult for the attacker as possible. In other words, the presence of these satellite networks basically eliminates the element of surprise. And of course, this goes both ways. It is my opinion that this is one of the big reasons as to why all Russian offensives into Ukraine up until now have been so slow. Not the only reason, mind you, but one of the big reasons. And it is also the reason as to why the Kherson counteroffensive was handled by the Ukrainian side in the manner that it was handled, and ultimately why it was doomed from the start. And here I would like to recall the fact that this counteroffensive was being announced loudly and openly by the Ukrainian side and was being hyped up by the media in Ukraine and in the West long before it was supposed to begin. This is a very unorthodox move in warfare. One doesn't usually announce their intentions to attack at a specific location. But my belief is that the Ukrainian side chose to do this because ultimately they knew that it would be basically impossible to hide the gathering concentration of equipment and manpower from Russian reconnaissance capabilities. So instead of making any futile attempts to conceal this imminent counteroffensive, the Ukrainians instead decided to declare it openly and to use that declaration as a morale booster for their embattled forces on the front lines and also for their supporters both within the country and outside of the country, mainly within the collective West. And there are also some other reasons which lead me to believe that this counteroffensive was a very real thing that was in the works before ultimately collapsing. Some of these reasons include the fact that around the months of June and July, the Ukrainian side was noted to have been transferring some of their artillery systems, which I should note were very limited in quantity to begin with. These artillery systems were being transferred to the area of Kherson and Mykolaiv, presumably in preparation for some sort of battle. Around this time, we also saw the number of Russian missile and artillery strikes around the Mykolaiv region increase tremendously. The Mykolaiv region, of course, being the only place where these forces could have gathered in preparation for any sort of offensive or counteroffensive. There was also the long string of incidents involving the HIMARS missile system and the Antonovsky Bridge, which crosses the Dnieper River near the city of Kherson. The HIMARS missile system continued to damage this bridge to the point where it was no longer operational before it was quickly repaired and then bombarded and damaged by the HIMARS system again, rinse and repeat. The purpose of this whole bombardment of the Antonovsky Bridge was to cut off the Russian garrison in the city of Kherson from supplies or to make their supply situation more difficult, which means that the combat capabilities of that Russian garrison would have been reduced, whether for offensive or defensive operations. And lastly, the reason that leads me to believe that Ukraine was indeed planning to be the one on the offensive rather than on the defensive near the region of Kherson is the fact that over the last 2 months, we have seen the Ukrainian armed forces conduct a number of combat reconnaissance missions near Kherson. There were a number of attempts conducted by the Ukrainians to send small groups of people across the Ingulets River, basically what the Russians and the Ukrainians refer to as diversionary groups, which are small squadrons of around 5 to 10 people with some sort of sabotage or reconnaissance mission in mind. There were also a number of attempts to send larger concentrations of forces, primarily south of the Ingulets River, involving companies, in some cases even battalions, and all of these attempts to test the Russian defenses in the area, to conduct manned reconnaissance operations, tended to end up in failure with high losses for the Ukrainians. I should mention that there are many videos out there on the internet which I'm not going to show on my channel, but basically these videos show these small diversionary groups being caught on film by Russian drones and subsequently being targeted by a barrage of artillery strikes. And one of the main reasons why all of these combat reconnaissance missions and all these attempts to gauge the strength of Russian defenses in this area failed so thoroughly is the aforementioned fact that the Russians have some very advanced reconnaissance capabilities. And in particular, I want to mention the fact that the Russians have some particularly advanced drone warfare and drone reconnaissance capabilities. Now, I've been critical of the Russian military and its drone warfare capabilities before. I've mentioned that drone warfare is one of the weak points of the Russian military, and of course, there are many countries around the world which have far more advanced drone warfare capabilities than either the Ukrainians or the Russians do. However, all of these countries have not recently been at war. So when I say that the Russians have some very advanced drone warfare capabilities, I am comparing them to historical precedents, to the Nagorno-Karabakh War in 2020, to the wars that the United States fought in Iraq and in Afghanistan during the mid-2000s, and also some other wars. And while the drone warfare capabilities of Azerbaijan in 2020, the drones that were supplied by Turkey and Israel, were fairly advanced and quantitatively numerous, I think that we should keep in mind that in that war, the Armenians had basically no drone warfare capabilities. The Russia-Ukraine war is perhaps the first war where both sides have considerable drone warfare capabilities. And indeed, many of these combat reconnaissance missions which were attempted by the Ukrainians near and around Kherson, these attempts to send small groups to cross the Ingulets River, these failed because the Russians saw them with their drones and responded accordingly. Now, drone warfare, the use of drones and anti-drone capabilities in the context of this war is a huge topic which I'm going to have to explore in a separate video at a later date, but the short story is that the prolific use of drones on both sides makes advances and breakthroughs incredibly difficult. And it's one of the reasons why the Russians have been advancing very slowly. It is also the reason why the Ukrainians, despite trying to on a number of occasions, have not been able to advance at all. Now, some people might point towards the counteroffensive that took place near Kharkov as an example of the Ukrainians successfully pushing back the Russians, but I think that it's important to note that one of the reasons that was at all possible is that back in April, Russian drone warfare capabilities were nowhere near the level that they are at now, whereas Ukraine still had plenty of large drones, plenty of Bayraktars that were supplied by Turkey, as well as other smaller and medium-sized drones, which were primarily supplied by other countries, but a few of which were also manufactured locally in Ukraine. And even with all of these extenuating circumstances and factors in mind, that counteroffensive near Kharkov was still not very successful, as the Ukrainians had to dedicate a lot of manpower to it, manpower which they lost and correspondingly can no longer replicate for another similar counteroffensive, and the Russians retook most of the territory that they were forced to give up over the course of something like a month. So in conclusion, I think that it's always important to keep this contrast in mind, that no matter how slow or grinding the Russian offensive in Ukraine is, What we've clearly seen time and time again is that Russia is able to conduct these offensives. What's more important is that Russia is able to conduct multiple offensives across multiple parts of the front line simultaneously, whereas Ukraine cannot conduct any offensives or counteroffensives whatsoever. And this is something that wasn't true at the start of the war. This is something that only became so fairly recently, largely due to the fact that the Russians now have more manpower due to the recruitment of volunteers all throughout Russia, and that the Russian military-industrial complex is working overtime to supply the Russian military with as many modern drones as possible, while the diametric opposite is true for the Ukrainian side. Ukrainian drone warfare capabilities have diminished tremendously since the start of this war, while Ukraine's situation with manpower is becoming increasingly desperate. Yes, on paper, Ukraine may still have a lot of soldiers left, but in reality, the vast majority of the Ukrainian army is at this point made up of poorly equipped, poorly trained, or completely untrained draftees. And these draftees are being sent to the front lines as replacements for professional military personnel, for contractors, for people with real fighting experience who have already been killed or irretrievably wounded in the course of the fighting. In other words, while the Ukrainian army might still be very large in terms of quantity, in terms of the number of soldiers, it might even be larger than it was at the beginning of the war, the quality of these soldiers, by and large, is far lower than it was at the start of the war. So we see a clear trend of the discrepancy in power between the Russian military and the Ukrainian military growing, and I expect this trend to continue for the foreseeable future.